The boom in Airbnbs and VRBOs in the Adirondacks may be hitting a little bubble. There are so many around now that short-term rental owners have more vacancies than they used to. And housing experts see this as an opportunity to lure those owners back into the traditional monthly rental market that local people need. That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Claxton Hepburn Medical Center, dedicated to providing patient care and regional services to the people of St. Lawrence County. claxtonhepburn.org.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Thursday, November 14th. First up, Adirondack green groups are reacting to President-elect Donald Trump's pick to run the Environmental Protection Agency. They're tempering their expectations for how former congressman and New York gubernatorial candidate Lee Zeldin will lead the giant agency. Pat Bradley reports for the New York Public News Network.
Scenic Hudson Executive Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Science, Pete Lopez, says the appointment of Zeldin to the EPA makes sense to him after working with him in the state legislature and when he was the EPA Region 2 administrator while Zeldin was in Congress.
He understands New York. My sense is that he has awareness and sensitivity to the region from a very broad perspective.
Protect the Adirondacks Executive Director Peter Bauer expects a very difficult time ahead.
I don't think we have ever encountered a leader of that agency who will be so strongly at odds with its historic mission and wants to completely change its role in public policy and environmental policy. I think the combination of Zeldin and Trump is very worrying on a lot of levels.
At the Adirondack Council, spokesman John Sheehan says the nomination gives them some concerns, but they want to keep an open mind.
While we haven't always agreed in the past in terms of policy issues, I think there is an opportunity for access and for a conversation to take place that could benefit the Adirondacks long term. But ultimately, I think we want to do everything we can to keep things from moving backwards in terms of environmental protection and public health, and we're going to have some work to do in the years ahead.
New York State Conservative Party Chair Jerry Kassar is delighted that Zeldin will lead the EPA, calling it a well-deserved appointment after Zeldin's near miss in the 2022 gubernatorial race.
He has a real background in environmental issues. Coming from Eastern Long Island, that should come as no surprise, but he has a balanced approach that respects the need for the economics of this country with the environmental needs.
Meanwhile, Adirondack Wild Friends of the Forest Preserve managing partner David Gibson feels Zeldin is being appointed to the post due to loyalty and sees it as a signal that the White House will expect appointees to toe the line.
Former Congressman Zeldin is a loyalist, and I think that's the criteria that's top of mind on all of the nominees that Trump is making. Now, Mr. Zeldin may prove to be an independent administrator as much as he can. That's certainly possible, but I'm not expecting it.
Lopez reminds anyone who is concerned about potential Trump administration environmental policies that New York State has the ability to set more stringent standards.
Whatever the federal regulatory and statutory framework looks like moving forward, that the state does have the ability to set its own standards that are more stringent than federal. So that is a power that New York State and other states have.
Zeldin was the second New Yorker to be nominated to a position in the incoming Trump administration. New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of the 21st District was tapped as UN ambassador. In Plattsburgh, I'm Pat Bradley for the New York Public News Network.
Leaders from 8 green groups in the Adirondacks sent a letter yesterday to Governor Kathy Hochul urging her to protect 36,000 acres in the park. The land is owned by the Whitney Estate. Saratoga socialite Mary Lou Whitney previously sold 15,000 acres to the state for $17 million in the late 90s. She died in 2019 and left the remainder of her property to her husband, John Hendrickson, but he died unexpectedly earlier this year. In the letter, Adirondack environmentalists say they'll help the governor acquire the Whitney estate, which they say contains 22 lakes and ponds and more than 100 miles of shoreline. A recent report by the Lake Champlain-Lake George Regional Planning Board found that the Adirondacks need an additional 7,500 housing units just for the local workforce. So where could that housing come from? Some not-for-profits have been working on building new housing. Others are rehabbing zombie properties. All that takes a lot of time and money. A new pilot program is exploring a different and possibly faster approach, turning existing short-term rentals into more traditional long-term rentals. Amy Feiereisel has more.
The number of short-term rentals in the Adirondacks has exploded in recent years. According to data from AirDNA, in 2019, there were about 1,900 short-term rentals in Clinton, Essex, and Hamilton counties. Just 3 years later, that number had jumped to nearly 2,700. That's over a 40% increase. And it's had a real effect on the housing market here. Megan Murphy is the director of Adirondack Roots, which helps over 900 families with rental assistance.
We had seen in the data that there was a clear decrease in the number of long-term rentals.
At the same time, short-term rentals have grown so much that the market's gotten a bit oversaturated. Murphy's heard that from local short-term rental owners.
They had found that with the proliferation of Airbnbs, that their income wasn't as high.
Sawyer Bailey, the director of 80K Action, has also noticed this trend. Bailey says data shows that short-term rentals in the region are making less money than they were 2 years ago and have less consistent bookings.
We're seeing in the data as well a lot more last-minute cancellations. So it's become harder to plan your maybe monthly or annual revenue from a short-term rental in ways that it wasn't before.
She and Murphy had the same thought. Could their organizations help or incentivize people to switch their short-term rentals back into long-term housing? Sawyer had a friend who had recently done just that.
And he said, Sawyer, how do we make this easier for people? Because this really is the cheapest, most immediate form of housing stock we have available. And Airbnb ain't as easy as you might think it is.
That's how those two organizations, plus Living 80K and Old Forge, teamed up for a new pilot program. It's paying homeowners to take their existing short-term rental and turn it into long-term housing. Steve Underhill, the Community Economic Development Director from Living 80K, says his organization was interested because the long-term rental market in Old Forge is basically non-existent. He knows that from personal experience.
My wife and I moved up here 3 years ago.
Since then, he says they've had to move 3 times.
Because renting is just so scarce. Every place we found is just come from word of mouth. There's just no market.
To try and create a market, the organizations will be paying homeowners $2,000 each to transform their short-term rental into a long-term rental for 1 year.
There's no long-term commitment. So if after a year you decide you don't like it, we're not going to come running back for our $2,000.
This is very much a pilot to gauge interest and figure out if this is a viable way to recapture long-term housing stock. Megan Murphy from Adirondack Roots says building brand new homes is hard and slow. Switching existing short-term rentals could be a lot cheaper and faster.
We've seen a shift in the market towards short-term rentals, and can we influence it a little bit to come back and sort of right size itself maybe a bit?
Sawyer Bailey from 80K Action says in addition to the stipends, they're offering other help, like setting up a lease, tenant vetting, and best practices as a landlord.
So we're really trying to help people set up what are mutually dignified, respectful, and yes, profitable renting situations.
The program is open in 2 areas, Elizabethtown and its surrounding communities like Keene, Westport, and Lewis, and an inlet in the town of Webb, where Old Forge is. Bailey says they're not expecting to flip a bunch of short-term rentals overnight.
This is a decision that people have to make that is for a whole year on their property at least. So we want to give people time.
Meanwhile, the organizations, and many more, will keep tackling the housing crisis in other ways, like rehabilitating rundown properties and building new units, both of which sit in the hard and slow category. Amy Feiereisel, North Country Public Radio.
We have more news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Ben Cato of Jay and Hart, Cox, and Legros of Malone. I'm David Summerstein, North Country Public Radio.